Hi, my name is Max Gaffin. I am one of Eastside's features editors,
Hi, I'm Brielle Lampf, and I'm one of the opinions editors for Eastside.
and we're here talking to Mr. Rosenberg about how politics and education intertwine with one another, especially at East. So to start, actually, Brielle, do you want to ask the first question?
Yeah, I can start. So, Mr. Rosenberg, how do you ensure that your students get the entire outlook on American politics, and do not develop any biases through any influence that you or any teachers could insert into your lessons?
Well, one of the things that I think is important is to teach the history around whatever the issue might be. One of the things that all teachers aspire to do when they're in the classroom, and it's done deliberately, is to not act as an advocate for one point of view over another, but rather, especially at the high school level, to act as a moderator. So when you wind up having a discussion in a classroom about, for example, a political issue that a student might read about in the news or see on the internet, what you want to do is to be able to foster a discussion amongst your students that is going to always be two things. And the first is that you want to make sure that everybody feels welcome. And the second is that you also want to make sure that everybody winds up feeling safe to express an opinion. So the way that you ensure that is by being an effective moderator of the discussion. And as a way to make sure that the discussion, whatever it happens to be on, doesn't wind up sort of veering off the rails and moving in one direction. And how is it that, for example, I might work on doing that? Sometimes if I feel a discussion is moving in one direction, perhaps I'll play, it's sometimes called devil's advocate, where I will wind up saying, well, what about this point of view? And that may be one that is overlooked or unpopular with my students, but it's all designed to make sure that they have a point of view that considers all of the different perspectives of whatever the issue is. I think that probably is one of the most important things that a teacher can do in the classroom. But to guarantee that the issue is discussed, but not in a way where a teacher inadvertently would wind up inserting his or her views into whatever the topic is.
Thank you. So going off of that question, where do you think the line should be drawn with inserting some sort of bias? So, for example, history is taught is so important to be taught so that students are taught the negative side, and so history is not repeated. The negative sides of history is not repeated. How did history teachers like yourself teach politics in a way that doesn't discourage anyone's beliefs, but allow the negative aspects of history to be institutionalized harshly?
Well, I think part of that, and it's a good question. I think part of that has to do, and this is just a general disclaimer of sorts that you might say, but one of the reasons that some negative history might wind up being repeated is because there may be events that are occurring in present day or that have occurred in very recent history where ultimately the action of government might be a little impulsive or a little knee jerk. There are certainly comparisons that you could wind up drawing between various events that were all very well intentioned, but part of the problem here is that politicians, historians, they're not clairvoyant. They cannot see ahead into what it is that the future holds. One of the big comparisons that we wind up making in social studies when we teach about the Vietnam War, by the time we get to the end of that unit, there are some very clear similarities that can be drawn between the Vietnam War and also the war that would wind up taking place in Iraq. Now, clearly, nobody wanted to go into the Iraq War to wind up just becoming involved in an international conflict. Was Vietnam a very traumatic time in American history? Was it a time where probably a lot of politicians and other people wished that they hadn't done something? Absolutely. But I believe during the Vietnam era and also during the time of the Iraq War, everybody was acting with the best of intentions. And I think that is one of the main points that needs to be considered. But just because somebody acts with good intentions does not always mean that the outcome is going to be perfect. So that means that you constantly have to revisit, revise, and reconsider a lot of what it is that present circumstances demand. And that way, hopefully, any decisions that wind up being made, if there is a mistake to be repeated, it hopefully will not be as traumatic or as long lasting as it might have been in the past. So in essence, it's important to make sure that, listen, mistakes will happen. It's a part of life. It's a part of history. It's just the ongoing lesson is to make sure that if they occur again, they're not as long lasting and they're not as traumatic as they might have been in the past.
Thank you. So teachers have faced a lot of backlash recently in the fact that some believe teachers only teach the negative side of history. What would you say to those people, and do they really understand what constitutes like a history teacher and what goes into your job and teaching the negative side?
Well, I think it's a good question again, Brielle, but I think one of the important things to understand is that history, at least in that sense, in the terms of your question, is kind of like the evening news. Rarely on the evening news do they start a story with, a Girl Scout cookie drive or the runner who came in first place. It's always about the fire that would burn down a building or about a murder that wound up being committed. Events like that in general, in our society at least, they should be ones that are rare. And when they are rare and they're destructive, they attract the attention of the public. The same is true with history. When you wind up talking about events that can be very controversial and sensationalized, like conflicts or wars or battles, that is going to be a large defining moment in American history, in world history, just as it might be on the evening news. Is that the only thing that history teachers focus on? Absolutely not. One of the things, and perhaps it might be a little understated, but if you take a look at some of the more traumatic events that would wind up defining modern American history, which is the realm that I teach, you may take a look at some of the things that would wind up occurring that define the 20th century, for example, like World War I, World War II, the Vietnam War, 9/11. Traumatic events, all of them. They resulted in the loss of American lives, criticism of the United States, and a bit of a loss of our reputation in some instances. But also take a look at some of what it is that would wind up coming about as a result of that. After World War I, you started to see the very early beginnings of the civil rights movement for African Americans, the feminist movement in the 1920s of the breakout of flappers and women's individuality. After World War II, you started to see the booming economic, the booming of America's economy, the growth of suburbia. We learned a lot of lessons after the Vietnam War and in regards to presidential power and the limits of it. Take a look at what has occurred as a result of the events that have come about after 9/11. All of the different security details that we now deal with in life each and every day. Now, those are all ramifications of some of the big traumatic events, and sometimes they're not as celebrated as perhaps they should be, but they are most certainly there.
Thank you. Over the years, politics have steadily become more controversial and personal to many people, including some students. How do you feel that school teachers like yourselves can keep political conversations educational rather than personal? And do you think that there's some sort of, do you think that some conversations surrounding politics should just be kept personal and not really be taught in schools, even as objectively, without inherent bias?
It's a good question. And I think a big part of it is that the answer to the question is that, yes, politics is growing much more personal to many people, students included. But it's not one that you can simply sort of ignore. And again, it goes back to what it is that I had mentioned earlier. I believe that there are some discussions, and they might be ones that are sensitive or controversial, that can wind up being had with, for example, a classroom full of students. If the teacher winds up acting as a moderator and understanding that you have to be both welcoming of everybody's point of view and that everybody should feel safe in offering that point of view, whatever it happens to be. And one of the ways that I like to sort of couch that conversation with my classes is to say, envision that the house across the street from yours is on fire. Obviously, that's a bad thing. There might be some people who notice the house is on fire and they pick up the phone and they call 911 and they report it. There might be somebody else who winds up seeing the house is on fire and then they run out and grab the garden hose and try to put the fire out themselves. Some people will be content to say, I've done my part, limited though it might be, and I've called 911. Others might say, well, that's not enough, and you have to run and charge into the house and try and put the fire out on your own. Those people are a little bit more, well, progressive. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. And I think that that sort of understanding about a sensitive issue, and what I mean by that is that there are people who may have a desire to do more, or that the government has to do more, Congress has to do more. And then there are those people or students who feel that, okay, well, there's a certain amount that should be done and no more than that. And again, that's fine. You just need to be able to wind up presenting that in a way so that your students understand that everybody is welcome to their opinion. And again, that comes back to the teacher. They have to act as a moderator to ensure that the discourse amongst students is one that is civilized and welcoming. Now, to get to the other part of your question about, are there some topics that should not be broached? I think that depends on the grade of the school that you're dealing with. And I also think that to an extent, it's up to the teacher's judgment to determine the maturity level and the readiness of his or her students. One of the reasons that I so enjoy teaching AP history is because a lot of the students are very intellectual, very well-rounded, and can maintain conversations like that, even some that are very controversial. But again, they need to be presented in a way that is very, well, again, very welcoming and very safe. And there have been occasions where teachers have received direction that there are some topics, without naming them, that we are not supposed to go in and not supposed to address in class because they are sensitive. But sometimes I can see how that might be for the best interests in a very general sense, but also sometimes those are discussions that need to be had. After all, students, at least at this level of their educational career, are on the cusp of moving into college, where those conversations are going to be had, and perhaps in a much more blunt fashion.
So as you've mentioned, you feel like having a moderator in the classroom is one of the best ways to keep a safe environment when having these conversations. Do you feel there are other ways to keep the classroom safe, or do you think that's like the main priority in having everyone feel welcome and open to share their opinions?
I think that is predominantly just my initial kind of gut reaction, is that that is the best way to do it. There are, thanks to technology that we have wound up getting, and unfortunately for Max, he can probably attest to it, I use Nearpod a lot. There are also other options that you might be able to use. There are technologies like Poll Everywhere, where you could wind up putting a question on your virtual classroom and say, well, who supports the idea of the Roe v. Wade decision that would wind up making abortion legal? That is a way for students to anonymously, safely offer up their point of view. And then it would wind up being up to the teacher, who is prepared, clearly, to be able to debate both the pros and cons, the advantages and the disadvantages of a Supreme Court ruling like that, regardless of how controversial it is. So if we were all together in a classroom and not in a virtual setting, I would say that ideally the teacher being a moderator would probably be the best way to do it. You can also do it through other tools like Nearpod and the ability for students to express their points of view through electronic messages and post them all over the screen virtually. You can use an anonymous polling program where students can express their points of view. And then the teacher can wind up saying, okay, I see where it is that 70% of the class thinks letter A, 30% of the class thinks letter B. Let's talk about the merits back and forth. And then you can wind up kind of, and the teacher would plan for it, but moving forward and saying, okay, well, here's the next question based on what it is that you've said. All of that can be done where you can wind up having a serious, legitimate dialogue with everybody feeling welcomed and safe.
Thank you. And so another question, another topic of this package that we're doing for Eastside is political polarization. So how do you feel that there is a political divide at East, and what causes that, and how can we combat that?
I think there is a a polarization, a political polarization that's going on generally, Max. Cherry Hill, generally speaking, is a rather progressive-minded community, and that's completely fine. Are there those people who are going to hold a minority point of view, whether at Cherry Hill East or in the community at large? Absolutely. The way that I view that is that that only winds up making our entire community more interactive, more diversified, and to be perfectly honest, more fun if you're going to wind up having a political discussion. Now, is there sort of a widening gap in the polarization? I would have to say, perhaps yes. It's hard to gauge without really doing any kind of a survey or having hard data in front of you, but everything that the news services happens to be telling us is that yes, it's getting wider and wider and wider. And perhaps it is. But one of the things, again, to understand is that no one is to be in any way ostracized for it or punished for it. That's what makes a more enriching classroom where you can have discussions like that are going to be more diversified with more points of view. That being the case, I enjoy it and hope that it would wind up continuing. And I know there was a second part to your question, Max. I'm sorry, what was it? I kind of forgot.
Like the causes of political polarization and how to combat that in an environment.
Well, the causes, unfortunately, are going to be many. You're not going to be able to put your finger on any one and say, well, it's because of the economy. It's because of the Green New Deal. Unfortunately, you're going to wind up having a breaking up of or a polarization, but it's going to be due probably to two or three big issues. But ultimately, it's not going to be any one issue that you're going to be able to say, all right, we'll get rid of this and everybody is well again. But the one instance of solace that I think can be drawn from it, and if we were all together as a classroom, that I would tell to my students is that, again, it goes back to what it is that you referenced earlier. Is this the only time in American history where we have been such a polarized country where people would wind up being on the edge of open revolt? No, it is not. We saw this in the 1950s with the second Red Scare. And although we haven't gotten yet to it in our curriculum, Max, and I'm sure that your parents and Brielle, yours too, can probably recall the year of 1968. That year almost ripped this country apart in terms of the polarization and what it was that was really aggravating people. And they were, just like today, they were polarized. They were demanding the action or the inaction of the government to solve those problems. They were frustrated with the youth of America, and you saw a big divide between Republicans and Democrats. We are facing that again today. Now, is it going to wind up resolving itself? I'm confident that the answer is yes. But unfortunately, in this age of instant gratification, we're not going to be able to push a button or simply snap our fingers and make it happen. It's going to take a couple or 3 years or some election cycles. But ideally, we are going to wind up having sort of a return to what many of us would deem to be normal. So what is it that causes it, Max? It could be a lot. And how can it be fixed? I think that it can be fixed with a couple of things. Understanding that events similar to what it is that we're going through have occurred in the past, and we have survived those, whether it was in the year 1968 or during the second Red Scare or the terror attacks of 9/11 or the bombing of Pearl Harbor. We have survived all of that, even as far back as the Civil War, and we have persevered. And I think that should be a big part of the comfort that some students or members of the Cherry Hill community would wind up or should be able to wind up having, that we have gone through problems like this before and we will persevere through it again. But the causes can be many. How do you stop it? I think patience is also, unfortunately, is going to be something we're going to have to utilize here. This is not a problem, unlike, where you send a text message and a second later you get a response. Push a button, Amazon tells you it'll be at your door in 2 days. Politics and current affairs do not work that quickly. We have to be patient. It's going to take us a couple or 3 years, but you're going to see the change come.
Thank you. So, as a teacher, are you encouraged to be apolitical and not exert any bias? And if so, how much are you encouraged to do so?
I'm sorry, say that again, Brielle. You kind of cut out for a second.
No, you're good. So, as a teacher, are you encouraged to be apolitical and not exert any bias? And if so, how much are you encouraged to do so?
Yes. Well, actually, we're not really encouraged to be apolitical. That is just something that a teacher instinctively does when he or she steps in front of their classroom. You do not want to wind up tainting the viewpoint of your students with your own perspective or your own political bias or your own belief system. So do we get, for example, emails from the principal or memos from the superintendent? No, we don't. But every teacher wants to be able to present the facts in an unbiased manner so that students can evaluate them by themselves and ideally reach their own conclusion for what it is that might have caused a political mishap or why an election went for one candidate versus another. Now, can students raise their hand and say, well, Mr. Rosenberg, what about this? Absolutely. And I love those types of questions. But any teacher, not just myself, we're going to answer them in a way that is not going to wind up saying, well, the Republicans lost because their platform was ABC and that was wrong. No, we're not going to do that. But we are going to wind up presenting facts that wind up coming forth in a manner that are unbiased, because ideally teachers are to be guides. We want to wind up providing our students with the information so that you can then reach your own conclusion. Can we be sounding boards? Yes. Can you ask us a question? Yes. But no one is here to brainwash you. No one is here to tell you to think a certain way, to be liberal, conservative, or to have you vote Republican or Democrat. No, we want to inform you with the information so that that's a decision that you can make on your own when the time comes, for example, when you have to register to vote.
Thank you. Just two more questions left.
Okay.
In a survey that Eastside conducted, a number of students felt that teachers should actually express their concerns, issues, and views with what is going on in the current political atmosphere, especially if such concerns, issues, or views stem from modern hot topics, pressing humanitarian social justice claims, or unfortunate events that are currently popular in U.S. society, economy, and culture. How do you feel about expressing your views to your students?
I have no problem expressing my views to my students because I don't believe that I hold any views that are exceptionally controversial. But with that said, I generally do not sort of stand on the metaphorical soapbox and preach my views to my students. That I don't do. When I am having a discussion with my students, again, I like to frame that discussion in a way that really puts the onus of coming to a conclusion on the student based on the facts. Now, you bring up a very good point. We are on the precipice of some historic events that no doubt are going to make their way in the next few years into history textbooks. That could be racial injustice, systemic racism. All of that is going to wind up coming in. I would be willing to bet my salary on it. At some point, that's going to make its way into a history textbook. Is that an event or something that needs to be addressed by a teacher in class? Yes. And I think that we would be doing an injustice if teachers did not wind up addressing that as part of modern history. However, again, I don't want to sit there and say, well, the police are right and this group is wrong. That's not my job. My job is to be able to present those facts to my students, draw a comparison back to, for example, another time period in American history when a similar feeling of frustration, anger, discontent might have come about. Draw that comparison. Take a look at, for example, at that time in the past, whenever it was, what is it that caused it? What would wind up coming about as a result of it? And then have a discussion with my students and say, okay, for example, what about the idea of systemic racism? How is it that that can wind up being addressed? And a student might raise their hand and say, well, defund the police or take away this tool that law enforcement uses. Okay, perfectly good options. And then, so that we can wind up having a discussion in class, I might take on the role and play devil's advocate and say, well, if you defund the police, doesn't that mean that you might have slower response times to an emergency if one occurs at your house? And again, that might allow for students with a minority opinion to kind of raise their hand and say, well, yeah, and what about something else? So yes, while I believe that there are issues that are discussed today in the media, should they make their way into the classroom? Yes, absolutely, because we can draw connections back to events that have occurred 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago. And perhaps that way, students can wind up seeing a potential solution that came out of that past event that might, with a little tweaking, be able to be used to remedy the event that we're dealing with now. Because ideally, many of the issues that we are dealing with now, in terms, while they may be different in terms of systemic racism or police brutality, many of them, unfortunately, are not all that different from problems that we have been dealing with over the last 40, 50, or 70 years. Police brutality, racism, they have been there, unfortunately, for a while. And progressively, one hopes, we start to make progress towards remedying the problem. So you can always look to history for a bit of a solution. And that's why I think that you both can and should have those discussions in class. But I am not someone who likes to stand up and tell my students, well, this is what I think and this is what should be done. But I'm not a robot. If I happen to see a student in my study hall or they come up to me during lunch and they say, hey, Mr. Rosenberg, what's your opinion about this? I'm happy to have a one-on-one conversation with them. But in the classroom, that's a little different.
Thank you. So last question. As a history teacher who dives deep into the history of the United States and analyzes American politics, do you believe that there should be restrictions on how teachers like yourself teach politics?
I don't know if there should be a restriction of any sort about how politics is taught. I think that there should just be trying to think of the best way to put this, maybe a continuous emphasis on making sure that whenever a discussion about politics is had, it is one that makes sure that everybody goes back to those two things that I mentioned earlier, feels both welcome and safe to express their point of view. Politics is going to be something many people, in terms of their politics, it's what helps to define their self-identity. It's one of those things that makes up their value system. And so it's something that many people will hold dear. And so an issue as relates to something that occurs in Congress or what a politician might say, some people are going to be very accusatory and others might be very defensive about it. But can those conversations be held? The answer to that question is yes, I think they can be. And I think the way that that should be done is by a teacher moderating a discussion. But that teacher also needs to be wary about the interest and the maturity level of their students. Some conversations, I think, are better held with students in 11th grade or 12th grade than they would be with students who are in 5th or 6th grade, obviously. But I think that there just needs to be a continued emphasis to make sure that everybody feels welcome and safe to join the conversation. But yes, I think that you both can and should discuss politics in class, especially as relate to history and the general study of social studies.
Well, thank you so much. I can speak for Brielle and and I'm sure that we both are very happy to have this conversation with you. And I think you brought up some great points that would be very useful for our package. So thank you so much.
Well, good. I'm glad. I hope I wasn't too long-winded. I have a tendency to run off on a tangent now and then.
No, I don't think so. I think you were great. But thank you so much. And
anytime, if you guys need anything else, you know where to find me.
yes, of course. Thank you.
All right, bye, guys. See you, Max.